These are 5 great series to get you started with modern fantasy literature. Now, fantasy can be a somewhat daunting genre to get into. A lot of the most popular fantasy series are either intimidatingly long, confusingly complex, or both. I'm looking at you, Malazan. And if you're a brand new fantasy reader, then you might not want to start your journey with something as lengthy as The Wheel of Time or Realm of the Elderlings, as ambitious as the Stormlight Archive, or as challenging as Malazan or the Hierarchy series. So, today I wanted to provide 5 quality modern fantasy series that should be accessible for someone who's brand new to the genre. Also, each of these 5 kind of fits into a different subgenre of fantasy and provides a very different reading experience. So, together, my hope is that they should provide a pretty good representation of the fantasy genre. We'll call it a fantasy starter pack. All right, so with all that said, let's get into it. All right, first up is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. So Brandon Sanderson is basically synonymous with modern fantasy at this point, so I would be remiss if I didn't include at least one of his series in my fantasy starter kit. And if you're looking to dive into the Cosmere, which is Brandon Sanderson's vast, interconnected universe, then Mistborn is probably the best place to start. Mistborn is a dystopian epic fantasy series with a famous, very fleshed out magic system. It's also accessible, fast-paced, and filled with plenty of action, political drama, and numerous other classic fantasy elements. Overall, Mistborn is just a great starting point for a new fantasy reader and a perfect entry point into the Cosmere. And P.S., if you want to dig deeper into the Cosmere beyond Mistborn, just check out my simple Cosmere reading order guide video. Next up is the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie. Now, if you're looking for something darker, grittier, and more likely to subvert typical fantasy tropes, then look no further than the First Law series. The First Law is basically the quintessential grimdark fantasy series, featuring morally gray characters, dark humor, and a brutal, realistic setting. So if you think that this brand of dark, gritty fantasy could be for you, then this series is an excellent option for your first taste, because in my opinion, nobody does it better than Joe Abercrombie. Next up is the Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo. The Six of Crows duology is a young adult fantasy heist series featuring a diverse and fascinating cast of main characters and a plot that is packed with twists and turns. Now, although this series might feel like a bucket of sunshine when compared to a grimdark series like The First Law, it's actually fairly dark and gritty in its own right. But because it is technically a young adult fantasy series, Six of Crows doesn't dig quite as deep into the moral shortcomings of man or paint such a bleak, brutal picture. But when you're digging into the fantasy genre, I personally think it's great to have at least one character-driven heist tale that keeps you guessing, and Six of Crows is a great option for that. Next up is the Empyrean series by Rebecca Yarros. Now, I'm trying to cover the main subgenres of fantasy here, so I couldn't possibly skip on romantasy. And I do think that the Empyrean series is a good place to start. This series is accessible and action-packed with high stakes, plenty of political drama, and some very spicy romance. Plus, it also features a dark academia setting and dragon riding, both of which are classic fantasy tropes. Now, full disclosure, I personally have only read a handful of romantasy series, so it's certainly possible that there are a few better places to start. That said, I do think that the Empyrean absolutely works as a fun entry point to the subgenre. And finally, the Rhaenyra Revelations by Michael J. Sullivan. So much of modern fantasy can be dark, bleak, and at times downright depressing. So when a series is more lighthearted and fun, it's very refreshing. While this series does offer plenty of high-stakes action and a classic epic fantasy vibe, it also tends to be irreverent and funny. And as an added bonus, the two main characters have my absolute favorite friendship in all of fantasy. Their banter and relationship alone make this series a must-read for fantasy fans, in my opinion. Alright, so those are my 5 recommended series for getting started with the fantasy genre. Now, because I really struggled to narrow this list down to 5, I did want to briefly name a few honorable mentions. And feel free to just swap these series in if they happen to appeal to you more. First up, the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne. Super action-packed, found family type of story, Norse mythology inspired, just a really awesome series. The Shades of Magic trilogy by V.E. Schwab. A very accessible, fast-paced trilogy with a really fun magic system. The Red Rising series by Pierce Brown. Yes, this is technically sci-fi. I like to think of it as kind of a fantasy sci-fi mix. But either way, it is an epic, large-scale, emotional roller coaster of a space opera. And it's maybe the most popular modern series in fantasy and sci-fi right now, for good reason. A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Another really good option if you want to dive into the romantasy subgenre. Gets a lot better after the first book, in my opinion. The Illborn Saga by Daniel T. Jackson. One of the most underappreciated series in modern fantasy, in my opinion. Just an awesome, epic fantasy, very character-driven, with a classic fantasy feel to it. And finally, The Darkwater Legacy by Chris Wooding. Another really classic fantasy type of vibe, adventure fantasy, with found family elements and a great friendship at the heart of the story. This and Illborn are not complete series yet, but I think they should be within the next year or two. All right, so that's all I've got today. If you are a new fantasy reader, then I really hope that these recommendations have been at least a little bit helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching. I would greatly appreciate if you like, drop a comment, subscribe, and that's all I got. Happy reading and have a great rest of your day.